You're listening to the DIY Recording Guys podcast, your one-stop information source for DIY music production, with your hosts, Vadim Karaz and Benjamin Hall.
Hey, it's Vadim, doing a solo episode today, part one of heavy guitar tones. Actually, we can say it's part one of part one because this is such a deep topic. I feel like I cut a lot out of this episode that we could have talked about, so we're definitely going to touch on this topic again in the future. But this week, all about dialing in a heavy guitar tone through a technique I call the guitar tone pyramid. And man, I'll tell you what, doing a solo episode, I think it's 60 minutes long, and you'll hear I started losing my voice at the end. I don't understand how people can sing for 2 hours a night on tour, and I can't do a 1 hour podcast episode by myself. So, newfound appreciation for you vocalists out there. Next week will be part two of heavy guitar tones. That's where we're going to talk about capturing the tones we dial in today. So we're really going to get into mic techniques, and I'll talk a lot about the Fredman technique and a couple of iterations I tried with it and which one I finally settled in on. Finally, mixing heavy guitars is one of my favorite things to do, or mixing songs that have heavy guitars in them. If you're working in this genre, consider checking out my website, calmfrogrecording.com. You'll see a button on there for a free test mix. So you click that button, you fill out your name, your email, and a little bit about your project. And then once we're connected, I'll send you a private link where you can upload your recorded stems. And then I will do a totally free, no obligations test mix for you. I will mix at least a portion of your song, depending on how long it is. And we can even go through some rounds of revisions. If we are happy with working together and with the result, then we can talk about doing some more work together. If we're not happy, if you don't like the mix or something like that, then no problem. We'll go our separate ways. Worst case scenario, you get a bit of a reference on what your stems can sound like mixed by somebody else. Best case scenario, we get to make some cool tunes together. So check that out, calmfrogrecording.com. Get a free test mix. Finally, if you enjoy these episodes, the best way to support us right now is to leave a quick review. If you go to the show notes wherever you're listening, you'll see a link. The first link you'll see will take you to a review page. Even if you don't want to write anything, leaving that 5 stars just makes us feel all warm and fuzzy inside, lets us know that you appreciate our work. It helps expand our reach, helps us get guests on, and helps us bring you guys some freebies along the way. Enjoy this episode. Back all the way in April, we did episode 13 on dialing in guitar and bass tone. And that was kind of a generic episode where Ben and I just talked about our respective techniques for dialing in tone, kind of irrespective of what kind of tone it is. So it could be a heavy tone or a clean tone or a bass tone or whatever else. Then we had episode 15 where I interviewed Cameron Davidson, who's the guitarist of the band Countdown from 10, on how he dials in tone. He's got kind of like a twangy, dirty strat tone, I would describe it. It's an overdriven strat tone. It doesn't really get into high gain territory too often, but it's definitely a crunchy tone for like a math rock type band. He took us through his process where he kind of starts with a clean tone and builds it up. So this episode is all about getting a heavy guitar tone, and I'm going to take you through my process and how I like to do this. Not to say this is the only way to do it, but I'm going to tell you kind of how I settled on this process, and I'll start by telling you kind of how I used to do it, and this will tie into why sometimes it can seem like it's so difficult to dial in that perfect tone. And by the way, tone chasing is like an awesome journey. It's kind of like the Buddhist journey to get to nirvana. You never really get there, right? But hopefully in the journey, first of all, hopefully you enjoy the journey, and then second of all, through the journey, you kind of learn something. So we're never going to end our tone-chasing journey. But the way I used to do things was I would kind of envision the tone I wanted, and then I would kind of string together all of my guitar pedals, my whole effects chain. I would plug it into the amp, and I would just start twisting knobs and trying to dial things in, and then, kind of trying to get to a tone that was better and better. And eventually I would realize that I had spent 3 hours only to realize that the first tone I had, I liked better than the tone I have now. Then you get upset. Then you don't want to play guitar anymore. Maybe I'm being a little overly dramatic, but probably you've gone through something similar to this if you're kind of a tone junkie. And so why is this, right? Why is it so hard, or why can't it seem like it's so hard to get a guitar tone? Well, one of the reasons is that there are so many variables in a typical guitar chain, and each one of these variables affects the tone. So like we always do, I'm going to invoke this analogy of a pyramid, right? So let's talk about what makes a guitar tone. If we kind of build it from the bottom of the the bottom of the pyramid up. So the base of the pyramid is the biggest part. At the base, we have the player. That's you, right? You, your fingers, your style of playing is going to have a huge effect on the tone, obviously. But for the sake of this discussion, you're not going to make a step change improvement overnight. So we're going to ignore that part of it for now. You have the tone you have right now for the sake of this discussion. Next, you have the strings and the guitar pick, right? That's the next thing after your fingers. The next thing after that, from the sound perspective, right? So you've plucked a string, that string vibrates. The next thing that those vibrations encounter are the pickups on the guitar. Pickups have a huge effect on tone. And we are talking about electric guitars here because we're talking about heavy guitar tones. After that, the pickups are embedded in the guitar body itself. So we talked in episode 31, last week's episode, we talked about how much, with Joe Golden, who's a luthier and repair tech, we talked about how much that wood type, the tone wood of your guitar and the neck and the fretboard and all of that, all those woods affect the tone of the guitar. Then after that, the sound kind of leaves your guitar. We have the cable. The cable is probably connected to some kind of pedal boards. Most guitarists use something in their signal path, so you have a bunch of pedals. Then from the pedals, you have the amp. Now the amp is a complex beast in and of itself because you have a preamp stage in there, you have some equalization stage, then you have a power amp. We'll talk more about those in a minute. Then finally, then the next thing is the speaker cabinet. That amp is driving a speaker cabinet. The wood that speaker cabinet is made out of, the speaker that's in there and how it's mounted, all of those things can have an effect on tone. Now, finally, coming out of the speaker, you have sound that you can hear. But in a recording situation, you still have more variables on top of that because you have to decide what kind of microphone you're going to use and where you position the microphone. And both of those things have a huge effect on tone. So this is our pyramid kind of from base to tip. Each one of these steps has, if you think about like the guitar has knobs, dials, all of these different things, right? Your pedals all have knobs, at least one knob, right? They can be on or off, and they have like some kind of knobs on them. The guitar amp has multiple knobs. There's a lot of factors here. So it can be overwhelming. And a bad strategy for me, I found over the years, is to plug everything in and start twisting knobs. I've found that just leads to frustration, and you might stumble on a decent tone, but you'll never really understand how you got there. And you'll never understand if you're compensating for mistakes you made early in the chain, later in the chain. And like I said, for me, it's just a very frustrating process to do it that way. So I've started building up a tone a different way, kind of from the bottom of this pyramid up. I'm going to take you through that process today. The reason I'm doing this now is because I actually had an opportunity recently to dial in a tone from scratch for a project I'm working on. So I mentioned this on the podcast before. I'm currently playing with a band called Changing Gods. There's one single out right now. That single, I played guitar on that single as well, and I did some production for it. And because that was kind of a quick and dirty job, I used amp modeling. And I'm just going to play a bit of that so you can hear what the guitar tone sounded like on that. So it's definitely a crunchy tone. I dialed that in using, my Line 6 HD 500X. It's an emulation of a Mesa Boogie dual rectifier. And the cool thing about this technique that I'm going to show you is it actually works for dialing in like plugins and amp emulations as well. But long story short was this project became a longer term project where I'm kind of officially the rhythm guitarist for the band now, in addition to doing production for it. So we're working on a new single, and I thought, hey, this is a cool opportunity to actually dial in a tone using an amp. So that's what I'm going to walk you through today. And again, this process really does apply for plugins and emulations as well. So the first thing we're going to talk about is that we need to understand the role of the guitar in a heavy tone. And this may sound obvious, but it's definitely not. And I still remember very clearly when I finally came to this realization. For years, I thought, like, I can't hear the bass in a lot of metal songs, not realizing that I actually could hear it and that it's such an integral part of kind of what we think of as the guitar tone. The bass and guitar are almost like one instrument in a sense. When we talk about heavy tone, we think about the audible spectrum, right? So we have 20 hertz is our submost bass frequencies that we can barely hear, and then all the way up to 20,000 hertz, which is like the super, super high frequency air type stuff in air quotes, no pun intended, that we can also barely hear. That's the whole frequency spectrum. And when we talk about these like big, meaty, metal, chunky riffs, a lot of the power of those riffs comes from that whole frequency spectrum kind of hitting you in the face at once. That's such a critical thing. I can't overemphasize that enough. And there's a tendency when we're first starting out, especially playing in our bedrooms and trying to dial in a guitar tone, there's a tendency to try and get the guitar to do all of that, to do the whole frequency spectrum, right? Crank up the bass, you crank up the treble, and you kind of get this big, chunky, meaty tone. And it can sound really good, actually, in your bedroom. And, when I play in my bedroom, that's still kind of the sound I go for because it's super satisfying to get that chug. But the reality is, in a busy mix, that's not going to work so well, right? In a busy mix, we have to have each instrument playing the role it was meant to play. In the case of the guitar is really like a mid-range, upper mid-range instrument, and that's where we want it to do the work. We're not trying to get the guitar to go down to like these 60 hertz lower frequencies where like that really kind of that kick drum smack, or not smack, the kick drum like boom is, right? Or that bass boom is. And we're also not trying to get it to do the really kind of high-end sparkly stuff that's usually done by cymbals. So I remember there's a project I worked on that's very near and dear to my heart because it was the first project, like prog metal project I did where I realized this. I kind of realized doing this project how important this concept and the concept of getting good recordings was, but also it was long ago enough that my mixing chops weren't as fancy as maybe they are now. Other than the fact that the drums are programmed, it's like a pretty organic sounding project. And I'm going to show you, this is just a riff off of that project. I'm going to play the guitar riff, and then I'm going to kick in the bass, and you'll hear such a big difference there. Or actually, you know what? I'm going to do it the opposite way. I'm going to start with the guitar and the bass playing together, and then I'm going to take the bass away and see what you notice. Bass. No bass. So you can see there that, like, first of all, there's a huge difference, right? When you drop the bass away, it just, all that power, you kind of lose all that power. But if I was to try to get the guitar to get down to those low kind of 80 hertz, 90 hertz, 100 hertz frequencies, it wouldn't sound as good because a guitar, just by nature of the scale length of the instrument, the string gauge, it's just not designed to represent frequencies that low, that crisply. So that's the first thing we need to realize. What is the guitar doing? What do we want it to do? When we're going to dial in our tone, we're going to keep this in mind. Here's the whole thing with drums, by the way. So you can hear that even with the addition of that kick drum, the kick adds even something else that the bass doesn't have, right? The bass gives us that kind of low growl, but it doesn't give us that transient attack, that smack, right? The kick gives us two things, really. It gives us the little subby, boomy stuff, and it also gives us that satisfying click at the top. Check that out. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is how much processing are we doing? And this is, again, an important concept in music production. We talk about kind of being as minimalist as we can, and there's some good reason for this. First of all, the more processing you're doing, the more kind of potential noise you're introducing, the more you're bogging your computer down, the more you can introduce artifacts that you didn't want. So we need to think about more processing as being potentially harmful to our audio. And simply put, what we'd like to think about is this. If we could get the tone, the exact tone we wanted, coming directly off of the guitar, we would, right? We wouldn't use guitar pedals and all these other things if the sound coming off of the guitar was already what we wanted. Keep that in mind. So where we're going to start with this guitar tone pyramid, because again, we can't really control, you are the player you are right now. You have the guitar you have. We don't want to necessarily buy gear. But the first thing we're going to do is understand the tone that's coming off of our guitar. What does that tone sound like? Because anything we add on top of that is going to start muddying the waters a little bit. If we go in with a bad tone into our signal chain, such as it is, well, we're going to have a hard time compensating for that bad tone down the road. And Ben and I have talked about this a bunch, right? It's harder to correct for issues you've introduced earlier in your signal chain down the road. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our guitar and we're going to plug it into kind of directly into your interface. Now, when we say directly into your interface, there is something to note here. Your interface probably can take a 1/4-inch cable, which is a guitar cable, but you want to make sure that you are plugging that into what's known as a high Z or high impedance output. We can do and we will do soon, a whole episode on impedance, so I'm not going to get into the details of it, but what you need to understand right now is that impedance is basically a measure of how much your component is resisting electricity flowing through it. And the guitar pickups are considered a high impedance device, which means the electrical current coming out of them is going to be fairly small. And so we need to make sure that our interface input is kind of designed for that high impedance output signal, right? So most interfaces can do this, that you might have a little switch on your interface that's something like switches you from, let's say, a mic or something from a line level to an instrument level. So you want to use that instrument level, or again, if it says high Z or high impedance, you can use that as well. So we're going to do that, and we're going to record the raw signal off the guitar. Now, when you do this, you want to try to record a riff that's kind of similar to the style you play in. So, for example, if you're doing a lot of like palm muty chuggy stuff, that's the type of riff you want to record. If you have some open chords, you want to record those types of things so you can kind of get a general feel for what your tone sounds like. So briefly about the guitar I'm using, I have I talked about this on episode 31. I have a production model Schecter Diamond Series blackjack guitar. It's a 6-string guitar neck through construction, and it has stock Seymour Duncan pickups on it. I bought this guitar before I knew any of this stuff. I bought it because it looked cool. I think some band I liked was using Schecter guitars, and I got a great deal on it. And over the years, as guitars have kind of come and gone from the studio, this has been remained one of my favorite guitars to play. Again, Joe Golden kind of talked about in last week's episode how the feel of the instrument is so important. This instrument feels great to me. It sounds great when it's not plugged in. It stays in tune really well. So I've kind of really liked it, although I am considering a pickup upgrade, which I talked about last week as well. But I will say a couple of things here as well. I didn't do this, and I'm not going to bore you to death with a million examples of playing with guitar knobs. But of course, your guitar probably has more than one pickup. You probably have a neck pickup and a bridge pickup. You should have already a feel for what the differences are there. Neck pickup tends to be kind of very thick and warm and creamy, but it can get a little muddy sometimes, and it can lack definition sometimes. The bridge pickup tends to be brighter and crisper. And most commonly for heavy guitar tones, you will see guitar players use that bridge pickup. That said, I used the neck pickup for years because I just liked how thick it sounded. And to compensate for the kind of darker tone, I would have to basically do things like crank the presence on my amp or crank the treble on my amp. But anyway, I am using the bridge pickup now. It's a humbucker. The other thing is the guitar has certain knobs on it. And here you have to consider whether your guitar has passive pickups or active pickups. Active pickups take a 9-volt battery typically, and what that means is there's a preamp stage inside the guitar, basically. So with an active pickup, think about you have a power source there, so you can do things like boost certain frequencies. Like you may have, I have a bass with active pickups, and I can actually boost the treble or boost the bass right on that instrument because there is a preamp circuit right inside of it. So if you have an active guitar, you can take some time to kind of dial in and play around with those settings using this technique I'm talking about now. In my case, my guitar has passive pickups. A guitar, again, think about what this means. A guitar that has passive pickups does not have any power supply inside of it. If there's no power supply, that means we cannot boost anything. All we can do with our knobs is cut stuff away. This is very important. So, for example, a tone knob. If you've ever played with a tone knob, you know that typically tone knobs roll off the high end of, the kind of roll off the treble. Well, this is important because, again, with a passive pickup guitar, I can roll off the high end, but I can't add to the high end, right? So, on my guitar, I just know that I basically I just dime everything, meaning I put all the knobs to their maximum positions because I don't want to cut anything away. I want to just get that tone as it is. So my tone knob is on 10 and my volume knob is on 10. But if you have active pickups or even not, you can play around with that and see what you get. So here is the sound coming off of. Actually, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to play you. This is still an in-progress production. So talk about being vulnerable. If you record music, you know how you don't want to play unfinished productions for people. But the things I'll do for you guys, I'm going to play you this unfinished production just to show you kind of the part we're working with when we're dialing in this tone. Check this out. So it's an unfinished production, but that is pretty much the guitar tone I settled on. That's kind of the punchline here. That's what we're working towards. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what that part sounds like. Here is the raw DI coming off of my guitar with absolutely nothing on it. Okay, so obviously we can't get to the tone we want without the amp and some other things going on. But what I'm really listening for here is just kind of the frequency content of this guitar tone. And this is where we're going to start talking about what different frequencies do for heavy tones. So the way I do this is, now that I've recorded my DI, and again, if you were going to play around with things like tone, volume, whatever else, you could just record this part a number of different times and kind of quickly switch between them and see which one you like the most. After that, you can do this thing, which is, I just pulled up a generic, stock EQ, the Parametric EQ in my DAW onto this track. And for me, I know right away that there's a kind of telephony honkiness. Again, I talked about this if you listen to last week's episode. There's something there that just kind of is too honky / muddy. It's that interface between honky and muddy that I don't like, and I'm going to cut that. I'm going to show you what that sounds like when I cut it, and then we're going to kind of go through some of these frequencies and you can see what I'm talking about. So let me play this here. First, without the EQ. This is with the EQ. So one more time. First, without the EQ. It's a subtle change. Let me play it the other way. First with the EQ and then without. And see if you can hear this kind of wah, wah, wah type of frequency that drops out. Sorry, not drops out. Comes in. So first with the EQ cut, and then you'll see that frequency kind of jump back in. So that's the EQ move I'm making, which is just a little bit of a cut around, I think like somewhere around 460 hertz. Again, that's specific to my guitar, right? But let's play around with this a little bit and let's see what these different frequencies sound like. What I'm going to do is just start boosting kind of a fairly broad frequency band. I'm going to start boosting at 100 hertz, and we're just going to move this up and down and just see what it's doing to our tone. This is 100 hertz. This is 400 hertz boosted. So you can hear that's kind of that honk that I'm talking about. Watch what happens when I cut that out. In, out. So it kind of cleans up quite a bit there, which to me sounds a little bit better. Let's keep going up. Here's 600 hertz. Without it. With it. So we're kind of getting into that a little bit more of a like a nasally kind of picture, like the guitar talking through its nose. We're getting into that kind of territory, and that's how I like to remember it, actually, like around 1,000 hertz, 900 hertz. That's when it's really nasally. Check this out. First without it, then I'm going to kick it in. Without it. Okay, so it's good to kind of familiarize yourself with these and start remembering what they sound like. In general, I'll give you some... let's just do a couple more here. Let's do 2,000 hertz, just so you can see what that sounds like. Here's without it, then I'm going to kick it in. So this is a pretty aggressive boost. I'm doing like a 7 decibel boost just so you can hear what it sounds like. But you can kind of hear in that 2 kilohertz range is it has a little bit of a bite, kind of is how I like to describe it. And then let's do 4,000 as well. Here's 4,000. First without it, then with it. Yeah, so 4,000, at least with the DI tone, gives you that kind of, I'll call it clarity, right? All of a sudden you get almost like the blanket has been pulled off of the speaker, so you can get some clarity there. So a couple of notes about these frequencies. Again, you play around with this because your guitar is different and your whole situation is different. Also, the tone you're going for is different. But a couple of general notes. 4,000, like I said, is kind of like clarity or presence, but too much and it'll start becoming very harsh. Our ears are very, very sensitive in the 2,000 to 5,000 hertz range. That's kind of where we're maybe most sensitive. And so you can, once you start distorting these frequencies, that 4,000 might become really aggressive and really harsh sounding. 2,000 gives you a nice bite. It can give you a nice bite. Sometimes if guitars lack a little bit of bite, that's kind of where I like to look in that frequency range to give them some bite. 500 is kind of like the honky telephone frequency, which again sounds really cool for certain things, but in general, you got to be careful having too much of this. Let me play at 500 again. Without it, then with it. All right, so that's what I like to call the like telephone frequency, the wah, wah, wah. So that's, to me, that my tone has a little bit much of that. So I like to cut that. So this is a good exercise for you to do because you'll see why very shortly. But this helps you understand. What we're trying to do is get our tone to be as close as it can be to our finished product at every step of the way, because that minimizes the amount of processing we need to do. So in my case, all I did was a small cut at 500 hertz. So this is what I ended up with. Okay, so that's what we're working with. When we talked about our pyramid, the next thing in our signal chain was coming out of the guitar and going into some kind of effects chain, maybe some guitar pedals. But we're actually going to not necessarily break the pyramid here, but the pyramid doesn't necessarily follow our signal chain. The next most important thing we want to understand is our amplifier. In fact, I have this book by Mitch Gallagher called Pursuing the Ultimate Guitar Sound, and he has a quote. I actually don't remember who the quote is from, but he has a quote about, the guitar is what you're playing, the amp is what you're hearing, which is kind of maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but the amp is a huge effect on the tone you're getting. And we've talked about this, I think, in the guitar tone episode where, you can get a Fender Telecaster to sound pretty metal with a metal amp, high gain amp, but you'll never get like James Hetfield ESP axe-shaped guitar to sound metal with a Fender Twin. It's going to be a lot harder. So the amp is very important. So the next thing we want to do before we even start monkeying with any guitar pedals is take that guitar, which the guitar tone we understand now. We can sculpt it a little if we want. I'll talk about that in a minute here. We can sculpt it a bit if we want, but the first thing we want to do is understand what our amp sounds like. And there's a bit of a strategy here as well. So we think about our guitar amplifier. The first thing we need to understand on our guitar amp is which channels are available. So many guitar amps have multiple channels. Like, for example, there could be a medium gain channel, a clean channel, there could be a high gain channel. So we want to understand what those different channels sound like. And the way I like to work with an amp, again, if you think about what an amp is doing, you have a couple of things going on. You typically, on a typical amp, you have a preamp circuit. So that's the circuit that's taking your signal and boosting it. Okay, so we have that gain stage. Then we might have an EQ stage, right? Which can be as simple as like bass, mid, treble. That's our equalization stage. From there, our signal will typically go to the power amp stage. So the preamp kind of takes our instrument level signal and bumps it up to maybe a line level signal. how we can think of it anyway. And then the power amp is it actually takes our line level signal and boosts it up high enough that it can actually drive a speaker. And the power amp may have some controls as well. How hard we push the power amp is typically controlled by like the master volume knob, or sometimes there'll even be, a level knob or even a gain knob for the power amp. And there might even be some equalization stage in the power amp as well. So in order to not drive ourselves crazy, what I like to do is set all of the equalization knobs to their 12 o'clock positions. So we're going to set all those at 50%. We're going to set our master volume at some reasonable level so we're not blowing our ears out. And the first thing we're going to do is play with our different channels and dial in our preamp gain just to see how much distortion we can get out of the amp. Right? Some amps may not even give you enough distortion for the high gain tone you're looking for, and we'll talk about what to do in those situations. But you want to see what the distortion in that preamp circuit sounds like. And you kind of want to find a sweet spot here where you have enough distortion to get the bite you want, but not so much that the notes start to wash out. And the way you can test this is by playing like a big, multi-string chord and see if you can still have clarity between the individual notes. Are they all muddy and kind of mushy and kind of fizzy and fuzz together, or can you still have clarity and hear the individual notes? You want to find the sweet spot where you can still have the clarity and hear the individual notes, but you have enough of a crunch tone. Then you could try that with the power amp as well, just to see which stage gives you the distortion you want. For most amps, the preamp circuit is really designed to be where you introduce distortion. But on the amp that I'm using for this example, for instance, I found that I was actually liking the sound I got better by driving the power amp really hard, which makes the amp loud, unfortunately. But I like that better. It was more pleasing to me than just the using the preamp to get all the distortion I wanted. So once you get that gain to a good place, then we can start playing with EQs. Also, by the way, if your amp has reverb, start with absolutely no reverb, bone dry, okay? So, we've tested the gain stages, and again, we're listening. One question we want to ask ourselves, is there enough gain? If there isn't, we're going to solve that in the next step. But before we even do that, we're going to start playing with the mids. I like to play with the mids first because, again, the guitar is a mid-range instrument, and I find that different amps will push mids very differently, and it can really make or break a guitar tone. So I like to start by just, turn the mids all the way down, turn the mids all the way up, and kind of just see what's it doing. Again, see if you can use that language. Is it honky? Is it warm? Is it bitey? Is it harsh? How can you describe what that mid knob is doing? And then dial it in to where it sounds about right. So typically once I've kind of tested the maximum and I've tested the minimum, I will typically start dialing it up from the minimum until I get to a point it sounds good. Maybe if it sounds like it's too much, turn it back down. Find that sweet spot for the mids. After the mids, it really doesn't matter whether you do bass or treble. Sometimes I like to start with the treble because the treble can kind of interact with the mids a little bit. Like it can add some of that bite. Like if the mids are a little too warm, the treble might add a little bit of bite. But do the same thing. Turn the treble all the way up, turn it all the way down, and then find that sweet spot. And finally do the same thing for the bass. And keep in mind, we're not trying to get the guitar to do the work of the bass guitar. So we want enough bass in there to, have it be a little bit meaty. We don't want a thin tone, but we don't need it to be like super subby and chunky, right? I'm using a PV 6505 MH amp for this. This is a high gain amp, but it's a mini head version. If you're not familiar with these mini head or lunchbox amps, they're definitely worth checking out. They're pretty affordable and they sound great. They're not necessarily as loud as a full-size amp, but they can still easily drive something like a 4x12 cabinet. So I'm a big fan of these because they're cheap enough that you can kind of have a couple in your collection and get a couple of different flavors going on. Again, because we all have different amps, I'm not going to bore you to death with this here, but I'm going to just tell you that I have two channels on this amp, and I went with the higher gain channel, which is the lead channel. There's a rhythm channel and a lead channel. The lead channel is higher gain. And my there's a knob called pregain, which is the gain knob for that preamp stage. And I had this turned all the way to, or as low as 2. My equalization, I had the bass on 2 as well, so pretty low on the bass, although in retrospect, I could have gone a little bit heavier on that. I have my mids on 4, my high on 6, and then I have my power amp stage where I had my, they call this post gain, but to me it sounds like it's what's kind of the gain stage for the power amp. So I'm driving that pretty hard. I'll have that up on 6 out of 10, reverb all the way down, and then there's 2 power amp EQ knobs, one for resonance and one for presence. So these are interesting because what does that mean? Well, again, by turning them all the way up, all the way down, I kind of figured out what they were. I figured out that the resonance is what it sounds, well, not what it sounds like. The resonance is a bass boost, but it does something different tonally than the low boost. And I don't remember, but it seems like I liked what the resonance was doing more than what the bass was doing, because my bass is on, or my low EQ knob is on 2 out of 10, and my resonance is on 7 out of 10. And then presence I found was a little bit harsh. Again, that's kind of that typically, it depends. It can be on different amps, it can mean different things. It could be somewhere in between the mid knob and the treble knob, or it can be kind of have some crossover with the treble knob. But I had my presence on 2 out of 10 because I found that things started to get a little bit harsh when I turned that up. All right, so we've set our mids, we've set our bass, we've set our trebles, we've maybe played with some other EQ section knobs. So I'm gonna show you what this sounds like just with the, I just put an SM57 kind of just off axis. I'm gonna talk a lot more about mic placement in the next episode, which is going to be on actually how to record the tone that you've dialed in. But for the sake of this discussion, I just took a single SM57 microphone and I put it off axis. What that means is if you picture the speaker of your cabinet and you put the SM57, the microphone, facing directly into the very, very center, okay, that is called on axis. So what I've done is I've rotated that microphone so instead of going directly on center, it's at about a 45-degree angle to the speaker grill, and then I moved it up slightly so that it's looking at the interface between kind of the dust cap and the speaker cone. Okay, so right at that interface. And that's a nice default starting spot. We're going to talk a lot more about mic technique in the next episode, but just to give you an idea of this tone I'm about to play, and this is what I'm getting with those settings I just described. So even listening back to that, I can tell, right, it sounds really kind of thin. But, and in retrospect, I probably went a little too light on the lows here. But again, I'm keeping in mind how much work, especially on this particular song, how much work the bass is going to do. All right, so that's purely the sound of the amp. Let's talk about between the guitar and the amp, what's happening there. You've probably heard of using overdrive pedals and distortion pedals into the amp. This is great, but let's always think about why we're doing what we're doing. So I started talking about asking yourself whether your amp is giving you enough distortion. Some amps may not give you enough distortion. This is actually why overdrive pedals were invented. So back in the early days of amplification, you know, people originally designing amps weren't designing amps to distort. They were designing a guitar amp as a way to make a guitar louder. And slowly, players found that, hey, when we drive these amps really hard, when we drive the tube circuitry, we get this pleasant overdrive sound. It's a little bit of a breakup that they liked. And so they found that, you know, they wanted to drive the amps harder. So one way to do that is if your preamp circuit, let's say, is not giving you enough gain, you can boost the signal coming into the preamp circuit. And that'll help that circuit break up even earlier and let you get more distortion out of your amp. So that's kind of why overdrive pedals were originally invented. And that's still one common use for them today is, for example, you might want to have like just a light crunchy tone on your verse and then kick in an overdrive pedal, drive the circuitry harder, and get more breakup for something like a chorus, right? So that's one reason we would use an overdrive pedal. If you find you want to either have two different gain settings or you find that your amp just isn't giving you enough breakup, you can use that overdrive pedal to drive that breakup. And we talked about this in the gain staging episode, but most overdrive pedals have kind of two gain stages. Just like your amp, they have, or similar to your amp, not just like your amp, but they have a gain knob. That gain knob will introduce distortion inside the pedal circuitry, which might be okay, might be good. Or one of the other knobs will be a level knob or a master knob or volume knob or something like that. That is typically a clean boost, meaning even if you turn that master knob or that level knob all the way up, that pedal circuit will not distort, but it'll increase the volume of your signal coming out of the pedal, which will help your amp distort. So if you find yourself using an overdrive pedal, one thing you can do is do the same thing we did in the first step, where you plug your guitar into the overdrive pedal, then plug that into your interface and see what it's doing to your tone. Probably a more practical way to do it is just to plug that guitar into a clean amp and play with the gain knob on the pedal versus your amp drive and see which drive you like most. A combination of the two may also be in order, but as we talked about in gain staging episode, you typically want to pick one, maybe two stages as your main distortion stages and not distort kind of at every step of the way because things are going to start to get kind of really muddy and unfocused. So to recap, we want to understand what the breakup on our pedal sounds like by playing with the gain knob, and we want to use that level knob to boost the signal into our amp potentially to help the amp overdrive. In most cases, if in the kind of the second step where we tested our amp distortion, if you like the distortion of your amp, you will want to use the gain knob on your overdrive pedal sparingly. You'll want to really use the level knob to just drive the signal harder into your amp and help your amp break up even more. So that's one reason to use an overdrive pedal. A second reason to use an overdrive pedal is the way it shapes or colors the tone. One of the most famous overdrive pedals of all time is the Ibanez Tube Screamer. It's famous for that, Stevie Ray Vaughan solo tone. That's a tube screamer, but also it's used in a lot of metal tones. And the reason is, if you look at kind of what that pedal is doing to your tone, it's really doing kind of three things. It's rolling off some of the low end frequencies. Okay, so what that's doing is you perceive that as kind of the tone tightening up, because too much low end on a guitar tone, as we said, can be muddy, can be a little unfocused. So it's tightening up the sound. It's also doing a little bit of a high roll off. So it's rolling off some of the super high fizzy stuff. And finally, it gives you a little bit of a bump in kind of like the 900 hertz to 1000 hertz range. And if you remember from when we were playing with the EQ, that is a bit of a nasally thing, which may sound unpleasant, but it actually gives kind of a distorted tone, this aggressive bite that we a lot of times associate with modern metal as focusing on that frequency band. So that's why tube screamers are so popular. And again, a lot of times when people use those tube screamers, they have the gain knob all the way on 0, and then the level knob, pretty high up to drive the amp harder. And then the tone knob, you can kind of adjust to taste because, again, that's coloring the tone a little bit. So that's another reason to use an overdrive pedal. I'll throw out another option for you here, which is what I used in building this tone. I currently don't have an overdrive pedal that I love, and I have a high gain amp. This PVM 6505 is super high gain. I find I get pretty much all the gain I need just out of the amp. I don't really need to help it. But I did want to shape my tone a little bit. As I mentioned, I have a little bit of this kind of 500 hertz telephone frequency that I don't like. So what I like to use is a Parametric EQ Pedal. I use one from Empress called Para EQ. And what this is basically just like the EQ we pulled up in our DAW, but it's in pedal form. So it gives me 3 bands of equalization that I can play with. And all I did was I found that 500 hertz frequency that I don't particularly like on this tone, or there's too much of it coming off of my pickup, and I just cut it a little bit. The other reason I like this pedal is because not only does it give you these kind of shaping capabilities where you can boost certain frequencies and cut certain frequencies, it also has a boost circuit. So similar to like a clean gain knob on an overdrive pedal, I can actually boost the signal coming through that pedal and drive the amp harder, which I did play around with a little bit, but I ultimately found that the amp had plenty of distortion. I really didn't need much more. To recap here, I used that pedal to shape the tone in a way that I wanted to based on what I knew the direct signal coming off of my guitar sounded like from step 1, right, from recording the DI. I would have never known to do that if I didn't understand what the sound coming off of my guitar was. So this is a technique I like a lot because, again, that EQ pedal is in some sense more flexible than an overdrive pedal, even though it's doing something very different, but it lets you kind of shape the tone from a very precise way to a more broad stroke way. If you have overdrive pedals that you like, that's great. Again, understand what they're doing and make sure you decide whether you want to distort in the pedal circuit or not. Okay, a few other notes here. If you're using something like pitch effects or octave pedals, I have one that I love. I didn't use it in this tone or for this project, but I have other projects where I love to use the Micropog, if you've heard of that. It's basically a pedal that gives you an octave lower or an octave higher than the note you're playing. It's a really cool sound. I found through experimenting that those effects sound better ahead of the distortion stage, ahead of your first distortion stage. So for example, if you're using a pitch pedal and a distortion pedal, I would put the pitch pedal first. And the reason is because those pedals tend to do better when they're working on a clean signal rather than when you've introduced all these harmonic content in a distorted signal. You tend to get a cleaner, crisper, sharper result. Now, you may not want that, but I've found that for something like a rhythm guitar tone, I found that it works better to have those pedals ahead of any gain stage. Finally, reverbs, delays, and other time-based effects are typically better downstream of that preamp stage. Okay, so typically you'll see people, your amp, if your amp has a FX send and return, you want to connect those pedals, the input of those pedals to the send of the effects loop, and then the output of those pedals are connected into the return of the effects loop. Okay, and again, that's you can play around with that a little bit, but if you put something like a delay or a reverb upstream of the distortion stage, again, typically you lose focus. The distortion stage will start to sound a little muddy and unfocused. So play around with that, but those are some kind of best practices for heavy tones that I found. Again, just to recap how this works, we have what we call the guitar tone pyramid, and we're building our tone from the bottom of the pyramid up. So we're starting with understanding what is the tone coming off of our guitar. So step 1, plug your guitar directly into your interface, record a riff, see what it sounds like. Pull up an EQ and play with it a little bit. That can tell you how you may need to shape your tone. Our philosophy is always try to get as close to the tone you're looking for at whatever stage you're working on, right? That's going to give us the best results. Step 2 is plug your guitar into your amp. Turn all of the equalization knobs to the 12 o'clock position or 50% position, and then play with the different channels to see which amp channel gets you the closest to the tone you're looking for. Then we're going to dial in the amount of gain we want. We want enough gain to get as much bite as we want to get or as much distortion as we want to get without losing clarity. A nice way to check that is to play some big 6-string chords and make sure that you can hear each note clearly and individually. If your amp has multiple gain stages, like for example a preamp gain and a power amp gain, well, try both of those and see what combination works best. A lot of times power amp distortion does sound kind of nice and smooth, and it can be very pleasant. You may find that you have to drive your amp a little bit louder to get that power amp stage to distort though. So, definitely If you're finding you need to drive it to ungodly volumes, then help it out with the gain from the previous stage. Once we've figured that out, let's start playing with the EQ stages. I like to start with the mids because, again, I feel like the mids are really going to do the most work in sculpting the sound of our mid-range instrument, the guitar. So I like to turn them all the way down, turn them all the way up so I can understand the band, and then dial in those mids first. Next, whatever you prefer, either bass or treble. I like to do the treble next and get it to complement those mids nicely. And finally, we'll dial in the lows that we want, keeping in mind that we're not trying to get a ton of chug because the bass is going to be doing a lot of our work down in those lower frequency bands. When we're doing this, we're going to ask ourselves whether our amp is providing enough distortion. And our next step is going to be to put an overdrive pedal, if we need it, in between our guitar stage and our amp stage. With that overdrive pedal, we can boost the signal and help the amp break up, and we can also tone shape the signal a little bit. Another option is to use a parametric EQ pedal to get that boost and shaping that you're looking for. And finally, we said any octave or pitch effects we're going to put ahead of the distortion stages. That's pretty much it for this episode. Next week's episode, I'm going to take you through all of the different mic combinations I tried. I used Fredman technique to get my final guitar tone, which I was pretty happy with. I'll explain what the Fredman technique is, why you may want to use it, how to start dialing stuff in, and I tried a couple of different positions even with the Fredman mic technique, and I'll play them for you and tell you which one I liked best. Here's the in-progress production that has the final guitar tone that I settled on. All right. I hope that was helpful. I hope that helps you maintain your sanity when dialing in heavy guitar tones. It certainly helped me a lot. It's certainly a better technique than just plugging stuff in and twisting knobs. If you have any questions or comments, things you want to discuss, feel free to either drop into our Facebook community. Just go to Facebook and search for DIY Recording Guys, or feel free to email me. You can email me at vadim@DIYRecordingGuys.com. I'll see you next week for how to capture this tone we just dialed in. If you're enjoying the podcast, take a minute to leave a rating wherever you like to listen to it, or share it with your friends on social media. Also, Benjamin and I are working engineers, and we love helping people turn ideas into finished productions. So if you're interested in working with one of us, or just want to discuss a project you're working on, reach out. You can find my work at calmfrogrecording.com, get me on Instagram at calmfrogrecording, or shoot me an email, vk@calmfrogrecording.com. And you can check Benjamin's work out at dreamloudstudio.com. Hit him up on Instagram at dreamloudstudio, or by email, ben@dreamloudstudio.com. And finally, join our Facebook group to engage with a whole group of friendly, like-minded people who are interested in DIY recording. Just search for DIY Recording Guys on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening and for your continued support. I'll see you next week.